There are 7,000 dreamers in my home state of New Mexico. Here's one of them. This is Carlos. Carlos was brought to New Mexico from Mexico when he was less than 1 year old. And New Mexico is the only place that Carlos has known as his home. And I had the opportunity to visit with a number of young people that are very much like Carlos. They've gotten in a bus, they've come to Washington, they call themselves the New Mexico Dream Team, and it's a remarkable story. They told many stories to me about their situations that sounded very much like Carlos's story. They urge us to protect them. They're fearful, they're emotional, but they are also strong and courageous. And let's remember, these are some of our very best and brightest young people. We cannot lose them. We must continue to fight for a Clean Dream Act, no doubt about it. And we need to remember the 11 million undocumented immigrants that are here in the United States and strive and fight for true immigration reform. And I'd like to ask consent to have my tax speech at another place in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, working families in New Mexico want good jobs and fair wages. They want affordable health care and retirement security. They want a job and educational opportunities for their children. But, Mr. President, the Republicans' latest tax plan does nothing for regular families in New Mexico or across the country. It won't create good-paying jobs, not now, nor for our children. It will kick 13 million people off health care and raise insurance premiums. Their plan threatens Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And it does nothing to improve public education or bring down the high costs of college. The Republican tax plan overwhelmingly benefits the rich by giving huge tax breaks to their campaign donors, to the super wealthy, big corporations, multinational businesses, and hedge funds. And one of the biggest problems is that the Republican plan will drive up the debt by $1.5 trillion. And that means they will have to take a hatchet to programs that working families rely on. This is not a responsible or a fair tax plan. It's a hocus-pocus tax sham, and I oppose it. I have to reflect a little on this first year that we've seen under President Trump and the Republican majority. What a year of lost opportunities. If the Republicans had worked with us during this year, we could have had at least two big achievements, bipartisan achievements. We could have had a bipartisan improvement on health care, build on the successes of the Affordable Care Act, and we could have had a fair tax bill for all Americans. How sad partisanship and politics got the upper hand. The Senate and the House majority are pushing this tax scam as fast as they can to hide it from the American people. We have not had proper hearings, we have not heard from expert witnesses, or had adequate independent analysis. Even the Republicans don't know what's in it. My office has met with many New Mexicans raising red flags on the unintended consequences of this bill. No member of Congress, not Democrats or Republicans, has had enough time to digest and understand this plan. When it comes to legislation this important, we must follow the regular order. We must see a full analysis by the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation. We must hear from the best tax experts in the country. The American people must understand the plan, and every member of Congress must fully understand its impacts. We're not there. Republicans and the President are being straight about what this plan will mean They are not being straight about what this plan will mean for the average American. They aren't talking about how it will affect the president's own personal taxes. He touts it as a tax cut for the middle class and working Americans, but not one single objective analysis says it's designated to help the middle class. And his Treasury Department's one-page so-called analysis predicting a $300 billion surplus is built on unrealistic growth assumptions that no serious economist accepts. Even Republicans have said the bill is about helping their donors and cutting taxes for big corporations. The American people are not blind. They aren't fooled by the administration's fake numbers, and they oppose this plan. Recent polling, as recent as December 13, shows that 55% of Americans disapprove of the bill. 65% say the wealthy benefit the most, and almost all pollsters come out somewhere in that range. Now let's look at some of the hard, cold numbers. First, we know that the Republicans propose adding $1.5 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. This chart shows the difference between the federal deficit under current law and the massive increase in the deficit under the Senate Republicans' plan. Current law is in blue, as you can see here, and the Republicans' plan is in red. Pretty dramatic. Pretty dramatic. Republicans represent themselves as the party of fiscal responsibility, but incurring this amount of debt to give big tax breaks to the rich is patently irresponsible. To pay for this debt, the government will have to borrow by selling Treasury bills, notes, bonds, securities, and saving bonds. Based off estimates from the JTC and the CBO, the government cost to borrow to pay for this debt will be over $40 billion over the next 10 years, and even more after that, unless we pay off the debt. The American people will be on the hook for $1.5 trillion. That's $12,742 for each and every American household today. My colleagues have come to the floor saying this tax bill will provide an average tax cut of around $2,000 for 1 year in 2019. What they aren't telling you is that they are also opening a line of credit on you and your family of $12,000. This is the new federal debt that will be taken out on every American's name every year by the GOP. So much additional borrowing by the federal government can also drive up interest rates. Higher interest rates mean higher costs for government to borrow. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that if interest rates are 1% higher annually than projected, through 2027, the debt will be $1.5 trillion higher. That's 6% of gross domestic product, and the amount each American owes on their new forced federal credit card would go up even more. Increased federal interest rates have real consequences for the average American. A rise in rates can price out a first-time home buyer. It can determine whether a young person can afford to buy a car. The average American consumer does not want to see interest rates go up. And increased government borrowing and interest rates can take up the economy's lending capacity and discourage the very private investment Republicans say they want to encourage. Giving massive tax cuts to the wealthy also will force massive cuts in revenue coming into the federal government. When I first arrived in the Senate, Senator Kent Conrad from North Dakota was chair of the Budget Committee. He was a master on the federal deficit and on the federal budget. He understood the danger of racking up huge deficits, and in 2011, the Budget Committee was concerned that the debt threatened the national security. The committee majority developed a budget framework that Senator Conrad presented on the floor that July. He showed us many charts that day One showed that the government had had a budget surplus for only 5 of the last 50 years. That was in 1969, 1998, 1999, 2000, and 2001. In those years, revenues were close to 20% of gross domestic product. Around the same time, the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles Budget Commission concluded that the federal government needed revenue equal to 21%. But the Republicans' current tax cut legislation would leave the federal government with revenue of only 17% of GDP. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers sounded alarm bells in an op-ed in the Washington Post on December the 10th. And Larry Summers isn't alone. Bruce Bartlett was an economic advisor to Presidents Reagan and George W. Bush. In a September Washington Post op-ed, he freely acknowledged, and I quote here, had a hand in creating the Republican tax myth. He's referred to the myth that tax cuts lead to robust economic growth. Mr. Bartlett now says, and I quote, Republican rhetoric around tax cutting is, quote, wishful thinking. In reality, there's no evidence that a tax cut would spur growth. In other words, tax cuts won't spur economic growth. They will create more debt, squeeze consumers, mean steep cuts to vital government programs. So why is the majority pushing so hard for them? Why do they want this tax cut bill so badly? There's really only one reason: for their donors. Representative Chris Collins of New York was honest about why he has to deliver tax cuts. He said, and I quote, my donors, and this is his quote, Congressman Collins, my donors are basically saying, quote, get it done or don't ever call me again. Making the super rich even richer doesn't justify burdening our kids with huge government debt. It doesn't excuse threatening American health care, retirement security, and other vital programs. But cutting vital federal programs is exactly the price that the middle class and working Americans will be expected to pay under the Republicans' tax sham. Their plan calls for $500 billion worth of cuts. And Speaker Ryan is already talking about where they will cut. He said we're going to have to get back next year at entitlement reform, that is how you tackle the debt and the deficit. Frankly, these are his quotes. Frankly, it's the health care entitlements that are the big drivers of our debt, so that we spend more time on health care entitlements, because that's really where the problem lies, fiscally speaking. He wants to starve the Treasury to benefit the wealthy, and then he wants to slash critical programs that create jobs, support innovation, secure our nation, and help people pay for housing, food, and medicine. I want to support tax cuts for middle-class families. I want to help make sure working people can take home more of their pay. I also want to make sure we can pay for roads and bridges and schools and scientific research and national defense. Mr. President, this bill doesn't do that. It does exactly the opposite. It takes money from the middle-class families and it gives it to the ultra-rich. And then it leaves us with little to support our communities. Little for infrastructure, little to make the United States of America continue to lead the world in innovation and science and economic might, and little to ensure we take care of those in need. This bill also fails Indian country. While giving billions of dollars of tax breaks to corporations, this bill does nothing to spur economic growth or attract investments in our Native communities. Not even basic, low-cost provisions to ensure that tribes receive the same tax benefits as other governments, like state governments. Once again, tribes have been overlooked by the majority despite early and vocal tribal input on tax parity in Indian country. Mr. President, I'm prepared to roll up my sleeves and work with Republicans on tax reform that is fair, that simplifies the tax code, and keeps American businesses competitive. but I cannot support tax cuts that lopsidedly benefit the ultra-rich, hurt working families, neglect Indian country, and balloon the federal deficit. I yield the floor.